I'm going to talk here about Quebec's Bill 21, and I'm talking about it as an example of sort of the way that contemporary racial dynamics look in Canada. It is certainly not the only one. It's just the one that I'm going to dig into a little bit. We sort of talked about it a little bit in our discussion boards, but I want to get into this sort of experience. So the first thing we need to understand is that there's an evolution of the nationalist sentiment in Quebec that drove referendums in 1980 and 1995. So in the current day, again, this is the last sort of numbers that I saw, is that about 1/3 of the population of Quebec is a hardcore separatist. 1/3 of the population of Quebec is hardcore federalist. They want to stay in Canada. And 1/3 is undecided. Okay, so any future referendum is decided by that 1/3 that's undecided. However, if you ask a different question, and if you ask, do you want another referendum on sovereignty in Quebec? The vast majority of Quebec is like, no, that's a dumb idea. We don't want that. And it doesn't matter whether they're separatist or federalist themselves, they all think another referendum is a bad idea. Also connected to that is that separatist or not, most people living in Quebec, especially sort of white European Canadians, and it's really important because that's actually a larger proportion of people in Quebec than it is in other parts of the country, has a really, really strong influence, a really strong idea of what Quebec's culture is. And from their perspective, Quebec is francophone. It has a European influence. It values certain ideas, all of those sorts of things. That's it. So when we talk about certain kinds of ideas, we can sort of talk about, for example, Quebec is the country, the province in the country that has the highest rates of child rearing cohabitation. So parents who live together and raise children but are not married. And that sort of is connected to an idea about womanhood in Quebec and all kinds of other things like that. So there's a really, really, really strong idea of what Quebec culture is if you live in Quebec. And as the number of immigrants arriving in Quebec has started to be more comprised more predominantly of visible minorities. So if you think about where francophone immigrants are likely coming from, you wind up with Algeria, you wind up with certain countries in Guyana, you wind up with certain countries in Africa, you wind up with sort of a visible minority piece, and especially relevant to this conversation is that there's a significant number of francophone immigrants who are coming from the Middle East. So, for example, from Syria, from a lot of countries where the predominant religion is Islam. Um, and it's important to understand the sort of context around this. So, I'm not going to dig into French immigration policy too terribly much. Just understand that French immigration policy in France is quite assimilationist. So the expectation is you come from anywhere in the world, but you come here and you eat French food and you drink French wine and you watch French television and you adopt French values and you wear French clothing and all like you just become us, rather than the sort of multiculturalism model that Canada has. And there is a difficult sort of conversation there to be had around sort of how that means Quebec perceives immigrants to its own countries. I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about sort of anti-Islamic sentiment in Canada because it sort of underlies a bunch of this stuff. So as I said, the discrimination faced by visible minorities is disproportionately experienced by women, largely because they are especially visible. For example, Muslim women wearing a hijab, a niqab, a chador, any number of those things are visible. You can tell what their religion is as they walk down the street. So there's a tension here, and some of this is connected to sort of media portrayals of Muslims in that sort of they're portrayed disproportionately as terrorists. And then if you actually look at the numbers, way like when we sort of were talking about ISIS and Islamic terrorism, other Muslims are disproportionately the victims of that violence as opposed to non-Muslims. But that's not sort of the conversation that we have. We don't have the same conversation about sort of the experience of Muslims as victims of Islamic terrorism. There's sort of a sentiment around that. I'm going to talk, again, very briefly. This is a whole thing that I could do whole lectures on, but we don't have time. So when we start talking about an anti-Islamic sentiment in Canada, you get all kinds of things. So you get discussions about forcing the removal of hijabs and burqas for court appearances and passport photos on the logic that, like, I need to be able to see your face. There are sort of the kind of complaints, and I'm sure you guys have seen them at some point on your social media feeds, about comparing the level of support for veterans versus the level of support offered to refugees arriving in Canada. Just for the record, those are usually based on highly inaccurate data. Like, the numbers are straight up made up. But that's the sentiment and that's the comparison. And we also have some significant examples of anti-Islamic violence in Canada sort of connected to those sorts of ideas. So you have experiences of like mosques being the targets of vandalism, whether that's graffiti or arson or that kind of thing, other forms of damage. And then you have violence directed at Muslims in particular, such as the shooting that killed 6 Muslims at the mosque in 2017 in Montreal. So he won't be the person who committed that act won't be eligible for parole for another 40 years. And he did receive a life sentence, but we can't deny those experiences of anti-Islamic violence and sort of anti-Islamic sentiment in Canada. So all of that is context for a brief discussion about Quebec's Bill 21, which is Quebec's secularism law. And it is explicitly designed to ban overt public religious symbols for those who are working in and or receiving public services. This means schools, daycares, going in to see the building code people, applying for a passport, all of those sorts of things. And again, there's some exceptions to this. So small crosses and crucifixes, such as might be worn around your neck on a necklace, yarmulkes, which are the skull caps that Orthodox Jewish men wear, those are all acceptable, but headscarves and burqa and turbans are understood as overt religious symbols and are therefore barred from doing that. And this is framed as maintaining Quebec's character as a nation. Again, remember that idea that the population of Quebec has a very clear idea of what Quebec's culture is. And this is framed as a way of preserving that, of connecting to that sort of piece. I will say that idea of culture sort of creates some weird conversations. So, for example, yes, this is framed as removing overt religious symbols for those who are working in or receiving public services. Great. It does not remove the crucifix or prayer the prayer from the opening of the Legislative Assembly. So there's some weird conversations there about whose overt religious symbols are you really targeting here. There has been some significant conversations about the effects on individuals of a law like this. So if we say that you cannot receive or provide public service wearing overt religious symbols, and you have a religious belief that requires you to wear a hijab, wear a turban, whatever it is, you have 2 choices. You can give up your religious beliefs, or you cannot access those public services. And that is especially challenging in a number of sort of different ways when we start thinking about sort of, again, that sort of overlap of visible minority experiences and women's experiences, in that you might be, for example, telling visible minority women, Muslim women is sort of the general target around a lot of this, you might be making them more financially dependent on their spouses because they can now no longer work. They can't be nurses, they can't work in daycares, they can't work in schools without giving up their religious identity. And if they're not willing to do that, then that means that only one income earner is possible, and that sort of creates some ideas about dependency. When we start talking about this in a legal conversation, there's been some really difficult to read but important arguments made that asking women who typically wear a hijab or a chador to testify in court without that would be the equivalent, is essentially experientially quite similar to asking other people to testify in court naked, and that they may not be as willing to do that, and that they're going to be more uncomfortable and more flustered, and that is going to affect how credible their testimony is seen. And when you have a choice to testify or not, you may simply choose not to. And that means, for example, that if you have things like domestic assault cases, you don't have female witnesses to testify about that, and that sort of creates all kinds of other problems. There have been a lot of challenges to this law. Okay? There are conversations there about potential violations of freedom of religion, obviously. Potential violations about sort of having the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms interpreted in a multicultural context. All of those sorts of things. Quebec solves this by invoking the notwithstanding clause. It is one of the only sort of like one of the few contemporary examples of using the notwithstanding clause in Canadian law. But that's not really the issue. One of the reasons that makes this law contentious and testy in a lot of ways is that this law, as it stands, is supported by about 2/3 of Quebec's residents. So if you were to, for example, as the federal government, and there have been some conversations about why the feds didn't do this, step in, you're essentially saying to 2/3 of the population of Quebec that your opinion doesn't matter. And it gets even more complicated because if you look outside of Quebec, almost half, the last numbers I saw are about 48%. So almost half of the population of Canada would support something like that in their jurisdiction. So this is not an isolated sentiment in this kind of conversation. I sort of want to sort of make a brief stop here. It is going to be very brief. I can't cover everything. About how these sorts of ideas and these anti-Islamic sentiments are connected to far-right or white nationalist ideas and sort of movements. So these movements and these ideas are on the rise in most every Western democracy, Canada not excluded at all. In a lot of ways, this is a response to economic situations, so the loss of manufacturing jobs and the loss of wage growth. Conversations about population changes, so the arrival of refugees and visible minority immigrants, and women's place in society. So there's more competition for jobs because men and women are both working. There's a lot of sort of sense about not knowing what one's roles are, as well as a number of people who just feel entitled to women's labor and sort of get grumpy when they are asked, when they realize they have to do their own laundry and wash their own socks and cook their own meals. So there's that kind of conversation, and I'm not going to dig into that a whole ton. In a lot of ways, this is often framed as a return to something that existed previously, something better. Although I will also say this is almost always uniquely better for like cisgendered white men. White women to a certain extent, but generally speaking, cisgendered white men. So it's about being a return to something better, and that often translates to an anti-immigration sentiment, a sentiment around either expecting immigrants to assimilate, which is sort of the like easy version of it, or restricting immigration, or you can go all the way into the sort of like restricting access and that kind of thing, and internment and that sort of stuff, which we have also seen. And one of the things that is important to understand in this is that as the number of extreme cases of this kind of far-right nationalism, okay, sort of goes, as the example of the number of extreme examples goes up, people become more accepting of the less extreme versions, i.e. of Quebec's Bill 21. So Quebec's Bill 21 is more acceptable to the vast majority of the population, even though it has that sort of nationalist far-right sentiment, because internally, what people are comparing it to is, for example, the shootings in mosques and synagogues around the world, including in Canada. And they're sort of going, yeah, well, but when that guy shot up the mosque in New Zealand, he killed 50 people, and this isn't killing anyone, so this must be okay. You also have the sort of fascist demonstrations in a lot of other places, and it sort of normalizes these ideas and these restrictions. That is a really important part of the process to understand when we start talking about the rise of far-right sentiments, and Quebec's Bill 21 is definitely sort of in that category.